One of my previous bosses, Richard Fisher, who was president of the Dallas Fed from 2005 to 2015, was a big champion of globalization and open borders, and liked to speak a lot to public audiences about the virtues of open borders and free trade. And in our prep sessions with him, we would try to prepare him for likely audience questions. The hardest one of which to answer was, question, how do you convince a 55-year-old steelworker who has just lost their job to cheaper imports to continue to support free trade? Or, how do you convince a conservative traditionalist who sees the culture they grew up with being changed by new arrivals to continue to support open borders? I think it's too easy to dismiss such people as somehow bigoted deplorables. Rather, those of us who wish to sustain political support for a liberal economic order need to think harder about the concerns of these groups, and a conference that is being jointly hosted by political scientists and economists seems to be the ideal venue in which to do so. Thank you. I'll now turn it over to Thomas.
Thank you, Mark, for these poignant and provocative introductions. Welcome to the first panel of the day. My name is Thomas Osing from the Economics Department here at SMU. The first panel covers recent changes and realignments in world trade, with a special emphasis on the role played by the US and China for those adjustments. Before we get started, let me introduce the panelists, an esteemed group of experts on the topic of global trade. You find their full bio in the program, so I will make this very short. Our first presenter is Dr. Laura Alfaro from the Harvard Business School. The second presenter is Dr. Caroline Freund, joining us from my alma mater, UCSD, where she is the Dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy. The final presenter is Dr. Derek Scissors, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Each presenter has about 15 to 20 minutes to present, which gives us plenty of time for questions and comments from the audience afterwards. Laura, would you get us started?
Do I have to use this?
You don't.
No. Can you hear me? Yes. Well, thanks to the organizers, I arrived today at 2 a.m., so you do the math. I'm going to present a paper that we were asked to present at Jackson Hole. Actually, we're very thankful for the folks because it allowed us to revisit this topic. This is co-author work with David Chor. He is from Singapore, and I'm from Costa Rica. So we tend to joke that we're the small open economy representatives. And because of that, I lived through the optimism of trade and global value chains. I saw when firms chose to go to a different country to get inputs, to get labor, to sell their goods to another country, and in the process, bring growth and prosperity to different countries. So in Costa Rica, in the 90s, Intel chose Little Costa Rica to create a plant there. And again, I saw the benefits and the potential. And again, I am a globalization child. I am from Costa Rica. I married a Brazilian. I lived in the US. So in many ways, I cannot turn my back against globalization. However, you come to the 20s and natural disasters, climate change, pandemics, invasion, terrorist attacks, national security, and then there is a reevaluation of the benefits of globalization, global value chains, and this view that it can expose firms and countries to risk. I have to say that, as mentioned in the introduction, this is, in the background, there is this backlash against globalization, which I have documented in a paper with, again, David and Maggie Chen, but it is very developed country. Yes, yet the developing countries have not turned against globalization. It is a rich country phenomena, but indeed it has allowed or promoted the increasing barriers, and also this new view of favoring friends in supply chains to lower the economic risks. So what they did in this paper is we took a broad view of US global value chains going back to the 90s. If you're as old as I am, going back to the 90s is not that far. If you're my students, this is beyond their time. And so we look at hints of partners, products, modes, value chains to characterize US economic activity. And then we zoom in the last 5 years. At the time we did the paper was given the data available. And we have two big points. Just yet, we're not seeing the globalization, and I emphasize that just yet. And again, this is not a point that we are making, it's a point that has been made by other folks, Polantras across the river. I don't know if you know, there's a river between HBS and Cambridge, so we always say across the river is the other side. Richard Bowen, Penny Goldberg, so many folks have said this. And one reason is one needs to be careful. We're not going to see the growth rates that we saw 80s, 90s now. The growth rate that you get when you go from 1 to 2 to 2 to 3 is very different when you go to 1 million, 1 million and 1, 1 million and 2. And a little bit of that is happening. The second is that China achieved levels of trade, exports and imports to GDP that for a country that size, one would argue were too large. And there has been a rebalancing, and I would argue there should be a rebalancing in China towards domestic. But that is going to look like deglobalization. And the rest, it has to do also with the trade of commodities, in particular oil products, and I'll get to that in a second. But what we do see, and again, this has been documented by many authors, Caroline has documented, IMF has documented, many authors have documented this, we do see a reallocation of the US trade away from China. And in the paper, we single the role of Vietnam and the role of Mexico as examples of low cost and also nearshoring. But we do caution that this is costly, and we have some evidence related to that. And at the end, it will not end dependence with China. Not that necessarily that was the objective of the policy, but given the size of China, it will be hard to undo it. So as I said, in the paper, we look a little bit, going back to the 90s. The 90s had this interesting phenomenon that you already saw, this change in the type of countries the US was trading. So there was a change from high-income countries to low-income countries. It went to Japan, to China, and from Canada to Mexico. And so those are the dashed line and the gray line. What is interesting about the US trade is that in this period, despite the fluctuations, global value chains are more really regional value chains. And again, this is not a point we're making. It has been made by many authors. Baldwin has said it. The US has kept this trade with NAFTA. I know the name changed. I just don't like the new name. So I'm going to stay with NAFTA. I don't know if you know this. For me in Spanish, it sounds like mosca, which is fly. Mosca. So I'll stay with NAFTA. So the US trades with NAFTA close to 30%, 20% Europe, 40% Asia, very little with Africa. And when there have been shifts, they have basically been within regions. So when Japan lost, China won. And now that China's losing, Asia's winning. When Canada lost a little bit, it went to Mexico. When Germany and France lost, Slovakia and Czech Republic won. So it has remained very stable, which I think is amazing given all the shocks that we have seen. And the other phenomenon is that rich countries have remained engaged with the US, but in a different way. They have set plans in the US, foreign direct investment. So when Japan was being accused that their better cars in terms of climate was affecting the US technology that was not keeping up, so the Japanese did the restrictions in quotas, but then they came and started plants here. When there were concerns about the ball bearings, there is always people in security worry about the ball bearings. I don't even know, like the little thing to make things go around. They were all in Japan. There was concern that they were all in Japan. Japan came and opened one plant in the US. Semiconductors, they came and they did it in the US. Electronics, so the same stories we hear. Japan came and started plants in the US. And so if you look at what Japan sells via plants in the US plus imports, it turns out that their engagement with the US is higher than the one of China, and that is the blue line. And I want to get back to this because FDI has always been a way in which we can circumvent tariff barriers. There may be issues in China being able to replicate that in the US, but not necessarily in some other countries. The other summary statistic that we add is a measure that was constructed by my co-author, which is upstreamness. It's a summary statistic of how upstream or downstream US exports and imports are. A product is very downstream if it's close to the consumer. So think textiles, toys, that goes directly to the consumer. A product is very upstream if it has to go many stages until it reaches the consumer. Think petrochemicals, think oil, think commodities. US exports, on average, have always been very upstream. The US tends to sell semiconductors, so on and so forth, is relatively upstream. The imports are relatively downstream. It's the toys, it's the textiles. But there was this interesting change. Does this work? No. So there's this interesting change around the 2000s where US imports became really downstream. That is associated with the fact that the US became energy independent. So the US becoming energy independent, the US is consuming less energy, but the shale gas revolution and oil meant that the US didn't have to go abroad to buy oil as much. And it turns out China didn't take that oil from the world. So these changes, when you look at global trade, they look like there is less trade, because indeed, the US is now doing it inside the country, but that is not really what we think of deglobalization. And one needs to be careful because climate change fighting would mean a lot of energy sources that tend to be very domestic. So there will be a move by many countries to use energy within and not trade it, and that may look like globalization. And so, and I'll get back to that increase at the end. So, move forward to the last 5 years. And in these 5 years, the US imports grew. If you add 23, they still grew. They still grew also in real terms. If you stay at 22, even imports from China grew. They were actually down if you add 2023. But what cannot be denied, and again, Caroline has written about this, and it has been documented, is this shift in the trade of the US. So the main increase, so China has lost 5 percentage points on imports from the US. It used to be 22%, now it's 17%. If China loses, Asia loses, who's winning? Vietnam is winning. Who else is winning? What we call high-income Asia is Taiwan, is Korea, is also middle-income Asia, is India, is Malaysia, is Thailand. There was a little bit of a win by Switzerland and Ireland, that was COVID. But what we also stress is Canada and Mexico. Canada actually had been losing a little bit of market share and is coming back. Mexico won market share, and I find it to be interesting, or we found it to be interesting, because the share was already very high, and it still is winning. And so we focus on 4 products people have been discussing. This is auto parts, semiconductors, electronics, and with some attention, you can do a little bit of seeing the patterns. In auto, Vietnam was not really doing a lot of auto, but you see Mexico winning. Auto parts, you see Mexico and Vietnam winning. Semiconductors, you see, as I said, high-income Asia winning. And electronics, you see Mexico and Vietnam winning. And in all of these, you see the lost market share by China. And so we did a little bit of econometrics. I'm not going to bother you a lot with this. What we did is, let me see the products at 4 digits where China lost market share. Let me see those products in the different countries: Vietnam, Mexico, Canada, high-income Asia, middle-income Asia, Ireland, and Switzerland. And those little stars mean that basically these are the countries that gain the market share. The rest of the world is not significant. So it's not a mechanical that this has to add to 1. But the other thing that we found interesting, and so we plot here 4 digits. One needs to be careful when you start looking at detailed product level, because you end up going into a rat hole and you start looking, oh, this is electronics, oh, this is semiconductors, oh, this is paper products, this is wool, this is, and you do waste a lot of time doing this. But what we thought it was interesting is that they're very populated. You see a lot of 4 digits. And for me, what was more interesting is the fact that Mexico has every single product. Maybe here in Texas, you already know it. I was always aware qualitatively how the relation Mexico-US, I was not aware quantitatively how deep it is. It is all the products and it's in very respectable quantities. And even then, Mexico has won market share. And so we went and looked Vietnam, what is winning, and it tends to be low income, high labor products, very downstream still. It's gaining a little bit more, but it's apparel, a little bit more electronics, again, going up a little bit upstream, but it's still very labor intensive. Mexico is all over. Mexico is everything you can think of. And again, here you guys knew it. I have always known qualitatively, I was just impressed the level of this relation, and many things are things that benefit from being close transportation costs. And in any case, we still find that a lot of this push was driven by the tariffs. Some concerns. The tariffs have implied higher costs. We use unit values as a proxy of cost, and we go and look things that are coming from Vietnam, things that are coming from Mexico that used to come from China. They are more expensive, 10% more expensive in Mexico, 3% Mexico. And those are interesting numbers because inflation went up to 10% and now it's stuck in 3%. Again, these are relative prices, but still. How much do we still have? Okay, and I show you patterns in trade in a new a project with co-authors. We're looking at firm-level data. We're matching firm-level data with the credit registry, and we're finding that banks actively help firms to engage into this reallocation. So again, the tariffs gave the push, but the banking system has helped these firms reallocate and find suppliers. This is a new project that we're doing. Also thinking about firms, we find that there is indeed intent. So you go and read earning calls and you do find, I was in China, I want to go to Mexico. I was in China, I want to go to Vietnam. This is also part from an overall process in which firms in general are not investing as much as China. In China, this is not per se related to the tariffs. It precedes the tariffs. It has to do with the China political economy. But then this is our caution number 2. As I told you, how Japan found a way around tariffs and other concerns, China is finding a way through FDI. So if you go and look at Mexico FDI, and Mexico has an amazing data set you can find by product, by state, by type, in general is dominated by the US. And I was in a conference recently with Luis de la Calle, who was one of the negotiators of NAFTA, and he said it was a strategy of China. China always saw Mexico as a competitor, but now they're changing because of what's going on. And so if you see overall FDI in Mexico is still US, but if you zoom in into certain products, the growth rates are different. So if you go auto parts is China. And in fact, when I was there, he was talking to some Chinese firms doing ceramics, some other doing plastic dishes. Like it is coming. In Vietnam, it has always been there. Vietnam's data is not as great. Nina Patnick from Dartmouth has been working. And again, in Vietnam has always been there. So again, there are different modes of engagement. You can do FDI or you can do imports. If you don't allow me to do imports, I can find a way through FDI. But they're also doing imports in every other country. So of the US main top partners, only Japan is the one that has seen a reduction in China's market share. Everyone else has increased. If you go and look at the G20 countries, for each and every G20 country, China is either number 1 or number 2 import partner. So again, China's too big. we're not gonna see the change, and that's not the objective. But it is possible that we're setting the seeds to changes. There were interesting events in the 60s and 70s that gave us the globalization era of the 90s. End of the 60s, you get Canada, US Auto Pact. End of the 60s, Mexico allows US firms to open plants in Mexico, Maquila, tax-free. I know now it doesn't sound like a big deal. It was a big deal for the Mexicans to allow US firms. US first trade deficit, 1971. First Japanese manufacturing plant, California, San Diego, 1971. 1972, Nixon goes to China. So in those 5 years, we saw the globalization of the 90s. So it's possible that we are in that era. It's not going to be overnight. I do fear it's going to be faster than last time, but it does feel that we're changing with the events in the recent period. By the way, this is imports of capital goods and investment in Mexico. Since 2012, 10 years, they have never been that high. Imports of capital goods and investments. And I mention this because it's very hard to see all of these changes at the macro level in the Mexican data, but you see them in trade, you see them in imports of capital goods, and you see them in investment. So transformation changing. And then I told you there's a little bit of a tick in US upstreamness at the end. That means that defense is probably being done, but it's too early to tell. We try to use employment data to get a sense of there's reshoring. In most cases, it's hard to say is the tariffs. The only one may be semiconductors, but as we all know, those have been announced and will be produced in like 5 years. And so again, for this, I think we need to wait until the data and the investments takes change. But to conclude, we do see a reallocation. We do caution it will be costly. It won't end the dependence because countries can engage in different modes, and a little bit of that is happening. As I said, it is costly. But we do argue that it would be nice if there's a little bit more evaluation. I think politically it's clear that this is following the sentiment and backing, but I do believe in math and I do believe in evaluation. It's not perfect, but at the end of the day, this is taxpayers' money, and I think it would be good to find out if the benefits are worth all of the investments that we're seeing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laura. Caroline, you're next.
So I'm going to talk, actually it's going to complement well, I think what Laura just said. We have a lot of similar work in this area. Looking at US policy and the reshaping, so I'm going to focus a little bit more on the effect of US tariffs, which were originally the Trump tariffs, but have since become the Biden tariffs because they remain in place. And look at how those specifically have affected the reshaping of supply chains. But before I do that, I want to just talk a bit about US policy and what US policy or these big changes. So we started today by talking about that period of globalization and when most economists were defending globalization and thought the costs were small and could certainly be compensated by the gains. Well, now we've gone to this period where we focus a lot on distribution. There's a lot of concern about the potential cost to some interest in industries and workers in those industries. But there's also a security fear that is predominating, and I would say really caused this shift probably more than our departed care for the workers in America. As serious as that issue is, there's also a rising country that government has really shifted in a way that and the country's growing to be in many, you can measure it in purchasing power, and it's larger than the US, so China I'm talking about, and this real fear of what a world dominated by China would look like. So the policies are very, very focused on China, stay away from China, tariffs on China, as well as under Biden, the export controls and investment controls, especially related to sensitive technologies, which in many ways have held China back more than the tariffs did. And what we focus on in this work is whether US importers are seeking new foreign suppliers, what it looks like in terms of nearshoring, reshoring, and deglobalization, and which countries are gaining. And is China really being replaced, or is trade just becoming more opaque? And since this session had industrial policy in the title, I thought I would say a word about that as well. The other side of the US policy has been described as run faster. So if the US can somehow run faster than China, then that will also help. And that's, of course, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which isn't really about inflation, but I think in the Fed, everybody would know that, and the CHIPS and Science Act, which are really about investing in either the renewable sector or chip sector, both of which are strategic. And I think there's a real concern to this new focus of US. We've always done our best by allowing capital to flow where it's most effective. We have an amazing financial sector in this country. We source talent, or we can source talent from all 8 billion people in the world. We should be bringing more of that talent in rather than restricting it. And if we do want to encourage growth, focusing on research and development rather than trying to pick sectors would probably end up using money more efficiently. I've talked to folks a lot of folks in California working in the semiconductor industry, and it'll be extremely costly to produce semiconductors here, not to mention all the little bells and whistles that Congress added, like using unionized labor to build those plants, when in construction 90% of labor in the US is non-unionized. So there's just lots of extra costs that have been thrown in that are probably going to make this quite difficult. So let me just focus back on nearshoring, reshoring, deglobalization. These are the Google trends in the United States. And if I originally did this in 2022, and it looked like, COVID was a period when deglobalization was surging and nearshoring and these topics. But more recently, it's even more so. And what surprised me pulling this data just yesterday is that nearshoring is now by far the most important searched term. And you look at Mexico, the last time I was in Mexico, the business folks I talked to, they all complained bitterly about the government and everything the government was doing. But then when you ask, how are you doing? They say they're doing great. And I think that greatness, the economy's thriving, the peso is soaring, a lot of that is being driven by the United States and what's happening here, the growth here, as well as the US-China decoupling. Mexico was supposed to get the US market after NAFTA. That didn't really happen because China opened up at the same time. Now it's finally Mexico's turn. So Laura already mentioned this, deglobalization is really everywhere but the trade data. People were talking about deglobalization around COVID, worried about international supply chains and getting goods, although things were happening in local goods too. Let's not forget what happened with baby formula. So it's really just about concentration of supply that can be a problem, not about where it's coming from. But whatever you want to look at, during that period when people were focusing on deglobalization, trade was actually, after years of stagnating post-global financial crisis, was actually doing pretty well. Not a lot of evidence of reshoring yet. If you look at US manufacturing data, whether employees or output, pretty much back to where we were before COVID. So deglobalization is not happening, but decoupling really is. So if you look at China's share of US imports, they declined by about 5 to 6 percentage points between 2017 and 22, and another 2 percentage points last year. So just going back, what took 10 years to go up, so from 2007 to 2017, so from before the financial crisis to 2017, went down in 5 years. So it's pretty striking how big a shift there has been away from China. And if you look at the products where that's happening, what we did here is we took those very specific products that don't have tariffs on China and those products that do have tariffs on China. So remember, about 60% of trade has the tariffs. And then we looked at growth in imports from China, from the rest of the world, in those tariffed products and the non-tariff products. And China doesn't look that different from the rest of the world between 2017, when its share was at the absolute maximum, and now. It's grown about the same as other countries, but in the tariff products, it really, really slowed down, and other countries replaced China. That changes a bit in 2023. We've just started looking at that data. But I think there was also COVID in China. There's some other things going on that we'll have to parse out. But certainly from 2017 to 2022, tariffs fully explain that reshaping that we've seen so far. And a big share of the winners from that were other countries in Asia. So China's share shrank, but Asia's share stayed pretty constant at around 45%. As was already said, Vietnam has been a huge winner. We also looked at these strategic goods. These are the goods that are listed as advanced technology products by the US government. These are the goods the US government really cares about, whether it's the semiconductors, the vaccines. And in those products, we see an even bigger decline in China's share, and again, replaced by some individual countries. So just to say, as I said, we started looking at the 2023 data, and what's interesting there is Mexico took over. So, and here the shares are where 2 is 2 percentage points, or O2 is 2 percentage points. But now Mexico has surpassed Vietnam as the biggest winner. And if we look at just these 6 countries, they more than account for the loss that China has experienced. So if you look at the different sectors, the sector that China lost the most share in is electronics. So from 2017 to 2022, electronics alone accounted for over half of the decline in China's share of imports in the US market. And in that sector, the growth in imports from China to those countries is highly correlated with their growth in exports to the US. So what does that mean? As a country, say Vietnam, which you can see is up there, is exporting more to the US, it's winning US market, it's also importing more from China. So there's two possibilities here. One is value chains are shifting, FDI is certainly going into Vietnam. Vietnam is producing goods with Chinese inputs and capital and sending them to the US. So it's still Chinese value added that's getting here. The other possibility is Chinese goods are touching base in Vietnam and then continuing on to the US. So when we look at the correlation between growth in the very specific product category, so t-shirts from China to Vietnam and t-shirts from Vietnam to the US, we do see a positive correlation in controlling for other factors and whether these are in the goods China's exiting and so forth, suggesting there is a small share that's pure transshipment, but there's a larger share where it's correlated with intra-industry trade and with industry imports from China, suggesting most of it is more about shifting value chains, which is more beneficial for the country in question, but it still means Chinese content is coming to the US. It's just coming in this more opaque way than it was in the past. So the same time as we've been talking about mapping supply chains and knowing who our suppliers are, has also been a period where supply chains perhaps have gotten a little more muddied by this policy, which has created this kind of new round tripping of China content to the US. When you're concerned about getting too much of a product from one place, because what happens if that place is hit by a pandemic or has some other kind of issue, the strategy is to diversify. So just like in your financial portfolio, you don't want to hold one stock, you want to hold a variety, typically ones that are uncorrelated, so that you're de-risked. So there's been this push towards diversification, or that would be the best way post-COVID, and if we're afraid of one source, we should see in those products where we're reducing share of China, more diversification in suppliers. That's not what's happening. There's not, so the Herfindahl index measured here between 0 and 1, to 1 when it's all from one supplier, 0 or close to 0 if you have lots of little suppliers. There's just not a lot of change either in the tariffed goods or the non-tariffed goods. So not a lot of increase in diversification. If anything, what's interesting is the tariffed products tend to be products that were already more diversified. So maybe tariffs were strategically placed on products where we could more easily find alternate suppliers. And when you look at the products where China has lost market share, one possibility is many suppliers came in, another is one took most of that share. And again, it seems to be this kind of China plus one. So one country tends to replace China in any product. Trade economists understand this because relationships are hard to find, firm-to-firm relationships. The big firms tend to account for the bulk of trade. And there's likely to be one area that has comparative advantage. So one country tends to be replacing China. So this looks at the percentage of products for which more than one country more than offset China. And what we see is that in about 50% of products, one country more than offset China's loss. So if China moved out of sewing machines, one country came in. That's actually a product where China did move out and Vietnam came in. It overall, in 75% of products, one country replaced China by 75% as well. And while China remained, but at the same time as China's being replaced, you know, it's not fully a great reallocation. It's kind of like the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave because we're still connected to China. So we're connected to China both because goods are coming in through other sources, but also because they're actually still really big suppliers to the US market. So the share of products where China is a top 3 supplier is way more than half. And even in those products that are tariffed and where China lost significant market share, China is still a top 3 supplier in more than half of those products. It came down really markedly. So we did manage to reduce the share quite dramatically in those products, but more to the standard level across all products or non-tariff products, as opposed to China's not a main supplier anymore. China is still a main supplier of most products. So just to conclude, there's been a lot of reshaping more than reshoring. So US imports are shifting away from China, most especially in the tariffed goods. I didn't show it, well, I guess in the deglobalization graphs I did, there's been strong total imports, and even in those tariffed products, so it's not very suggestive of reshoring. Manufacturing's been flat, limited effects of tariffs on total imports. But reshoring would take time, so it could still happen. There may be investment that's going on, and it may happen. But so far, we don't see a lot of evidence of reshoring. There is evidence of nearshoring to Canada and Mexico, and that has actually strengthened in our most recent data. The trade in the strategic goods and industries, the ones we care most about, are shifting to countries with strong trade links to China and where imports from China are coming in. So even if we're moving out of those products most dramatically, those are the products where Chinese content in the world is still really important. De-risking looks more like China plus one than diversification that everybody talks about. So just to end with some implications, I think the one big concern is just that trade dependencies are becoming more opaque. Another is that trade will not restrain prices as much as it has in the past. So during that long period of globalization, we also had really, really, really low inflation. I remember every time I'd go to buy a car, I would get more features at the same or a lower price. That is no longer the case. So we don't see trade as much restraining prices, and I think that came out of Laura's work as well, where she showed that the prices from the other countries where we're replacing China are higher. And then resource use is just less efficient. In a less open world, we can't be utilizing our resources as efficiently. It's driven by politics and not economics. That said, I think there can be reasons for it. I think in addition to underemphasizing distributional consequences in the past, I think we've underestimated security consequences. And now as economists, we have to struggle to think about it's not just efficiency, but the security costs and how do we balance that? What do we want to restrict? What do we want to invest in? for purely security reasons. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Derek?
I'm supposed to switch.
Things keep showing a name, Tracy Yellen, on here, and I really wish I could talk to someone named Yellen right now, but probably not Tracy Yellen. I'm going to be talking about decoupling narrowly, so we're going from the broader deglobalization to decoupling, but I will not be restricted to imports and supply chains, and arguably I won't emphasize those. I should say I was one of the early advocates of decoupling. A few of us who followed China, only a few of us, recognized what Xi Jinping would actually be like in late 2013 and early 2014 after the third plenary meetings. Some people on my street did not recognize that and became very suspicious of the direction of US-China relations. So I'm biased, absolutely no question biased. Another thing that's different from my two colleagues on the panel is I'm very focused on recent events. Now you might say, oh, you're a policy guy with an attention span of 10 seconds. True, but I have a reason, a justification, which is in 2020 you could not argue for decoupling. It was just impossible, and the reason was outbound portfolio investment. Whatever you thought the trade effects were or were going to be, it was completely swamped by this flood of US portfolio money into China, including during COVID. And by the way, I'll get more into that later, but like I could not argue as a decoupling advocate that in 2020 we had gotten anywhere. So I really have to focus on recent years to make the point that there's something interesting going on here. Is there anything interesting going on here? Look, I'm going to start off with the boring, well, there's some decoupling, but there's not that much. That's dull. I'm going to try to make it more interesting. I'm going to say that the primary cause of the decoupling to now is China. The response has been by U.S. firms, meaning the U.S. private sector, and the U.S. policy side is quite unimportant. And what that means is, as we're all thinking about now what 2025 might look like, there's a lot more space for U.S. policy action. Good, terrible, whatever. You can have different views and different policy actions will have different implications. But we can go a lot farther on decoupling because U.S. policy is not really engaged in decoupling. It's really China. And I will start trying to make that point by making what I think is pretty not controversial by now. Xi Jinping doesn't like the private sector. He doesn't like his own private sector. He certainly doesn't like foreign private sectors. And that message eventually got through to the U.S. business community. It took a long time. And believe one of my friends, if you follow, the U.S. Chambers, longtime friends is Jeremy Waterman, and Jeremy and I would sit down and say, "Do you think the firms are ever going to understand what's happening?" And like, well, eventually they did, but it took a while. And so I'm going to go through the elements of an economic relationship from the Chinese perspective. So 2023 Chinese good imports from the U.S. fall about 7%. So China's imports fall in 2023. Economic weakness, substitution, whatever you want to describe it as. I don't have time to drill down into it yet. It's a bit faster than their overall goods decline, but it's kind of, their overall goods decline is 5 and the U.S. is 7. It's really, you're picking nits there. The quickest drops from the U.S. are agriculture, which is of course highly politicized, and then China has to find other importers. And then there's just like these grab bag manufacturing categories. I'm looking at the Chinese commodities data. And that's substitute by domestic output. It's hard to see much of a trend there. Xi Jinping has this very famous for China Watcher statement about we need to make the world more dependent on us and we need to be less dependent on the world. But he doesn't provide any detail about that. And so you don't really have policy guidance and you don't have a lot of evidence in the data. So I'm not seeing much action on the import side in the most recent data. Export data, China doesn't, we always think on the export side about restricting technology. The Chinese are interested in restricting data itself. That is a policy, an evolving policy situation. And then they've gotten a lot of attention for restricting certain elements. The elements don't matter in volume, and they appear to be responsive, so we're responding to overseas developments rather than them initiating, you can't have germanium, you can't have this rare earth or that rare earth. The data controls have been claimed by multinationals as a reason for disinvestment in China. And so the Chinese have responded to that to some extent by loosening them in theory. The question was always the practice. So we haven't seen, in my view, export controls from China that are durable that would cause decoupling, but we've seen them hint at it in a way that makes multinationals unhappy. That this is on the table, and it's an evolving policy area. Inbound investment is what gets a lot of attention. The Ministry of Commerce says that inbound investment fell 8% in 2023. The number you see in the press that gets a lot of attention is the 80% drop in SAFE, State Administration of Foreign Exchange, balance of payments, direct investment liabilities. That stirs in reinvestment of earnings, and it basically says multinationals don't want more exposure to China. So like, think of the 80% drop as 80%, this is not exactly true, but it's the reflection. The 80% of multinationals don't want to be more exposed to China. It's not that they're like actually reducing their investment position by a large amount. It's also true on the portfolio side. It's less sharp, but you're also getting a drop in portfolio liabilities. Xi Jinping, you know, maybe he thinks this is happening a little too fast or is a little too stark, but there's no way he's really upset at this. It's you know, his behavior from long before he was general secretary, his most recent statements. You know, China loves stability, so anything that smacks as too rapid a change makes the party nervous. But he's not upset at less inbound investment. Maybe inbound investment should be in the right places, but overall we'd like to have less foreign capital influence over China. Last thing I'll say about China is outbound investment, and now I'm going to insert a shameless plug, which I did not warn the organizers of, but there is something called the China Global Investment Tracker. It is the only comprehensive public data set on China's global investment, meaning that we provide you with the transactions, and the plug is it's we. I created it back in 2004 when it was really easy, and now it's really hard, and I'm sorry, but it's still out there. And if you want to see transaction by transaction, large Chinese investments by country, you'll get this information. I would warn you against a lot of country reporting. A lot of country reporting is China announces that it's going to invest something, it doesn't happen, and then the countries get mad at the Chinese, but the Chinese didn't say they were going to do it. You said they were going to do it. Outbound rose in Chinese outbound investment rose in 2023 on our data. It's very weak compared to where it was before COVID. And what we use is documented Chinese statements to securities exchanges in their annual reports and so on. MOFCOM says COVID was good for outbound investment, literally. It rose in 2020. It rose again in 2022. It rose again in 2023. Pandemic, promoting togetherness all over the world. MOFCOM being the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. It looks like what they're saying, what they're actually doing is finding that Chinese money is going to offshore financial centers, and they're counting that as outbound investment, even though we don't count it because we want the money to actually go to a country that uses it. You've had a clear discouraging since 2016 of private firms going out. And that's because there was a rush in 2016, which you'll see in US policy responses, and they haven't really quite got over it. Too much money was leaving the country. It was actually a balance of payments problem 2014, 2015, 2016. And on the BRI side, and I realize the BRI is a big topic that a lot of people are interested in, you've also seen a narrowing of the BRI. China doesn't say, hey, it's this giant global program, everybody, 150 countries, and now it's 20, but that's actually what's happened in the data. And it may be that the BRI will re-expand slowly, but what you got is we're wasting a lot of money, we're getting a lot of press, shrink the number of countries you're really interested in. So that's the Chinese side, and the trade data I don't find very compelling, but the investment data, there's clear evidence of Chinese discouragement of two-way investment, not necessarily direct discouragement, sorry to use the word direct, not necessarily targeted discouragement, but just we want to be less dependent. We don't like the private sector. We don't like our own private sector, and we don't like foreigners. And that shows up in the results. Now, I'm going to argue that the U.S. is primarily responding to Chinese hostility, and it's done by the U.S. private sector, not by the U.S. public sector. So let's start with inbound investment. This is the one where it was an actual US initiative, coincident with Chinese initiatives, which is in 2016, some members of Congress get together and say, there's all this Chinese money flooding into the country, and every time I ask CFIUS about it, they don't know what's going on. And it's because CFIUS wasn't ready for the flood of Chinese money. You look at 2012 versus 2016, it's a huge increase. It's caused by Xi Jinping's hostility to the private sector and Chinese private firms saying, I need to get money out. So they bought a lot of US property that they lost money on. And they knew they were doing that. I talked to those practitioners when I said, you're repeating the Japanese mistake, you're going to blow a lot of money. And their answer was, well, if I blow 90% of my money in the US, I'll have 10% of it. Whereas if I stay in China, I'll have nothing. So I'm going to blow the money in the US. There was this rush of money, 2015, 2016, sort of extended into 2017, and the US said, we need to do something about this. We need to restrict the money, we need to know more about it, we need to empower the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. That bill passes in 2018. I always say it passed the House 400-3. If you introduced a bill in the House today that said American mothers are the best mothers, it would not get 400 votes, and it would get impassioned speeches against that. So this was a really popular bill, passed the Senate 85-10. So there is a situation where the Chinese got upset about Chinese investment in the US got upset about Chinese investment in the US. There were policy actions on both sides, and it worked. Chinese investment in the US is now negligible on the direct side. US outbound. So in the Trump administration, while we're fighting a, quote, trade war, unquote, and I'm perfectly willing to say you can call it a trade war, but it was not a real economic conflict. And we know it wasn't a real economic conflict because with President Trump's blessing, and I happen to know that, Secretary Mnuchin's protection, we had an increase in U.S. portfolio investment position by more than a factor of 3, $780 billion over 4 years. Find your trade data that matches that. Right, so we didn't decouple at all on a net basis in the Trump administration. Quite the opposite. We changed the venue by which we coupled, but we did not decouple. And by the way, I am not using monthly data published by Treasury. I hope this will be popular. We're in a Fed building. The monthly data published by Treasury say that the Cayman Islands is the largest recipient of U.S. outbound investment, which is complete nonsense since it doesn't have securities markets. This is corrected by the Fed. There's a Fed paper that publishes a belated annual correction through 2022 that does a nationality correction. There's also something called the Global Capital Project that does it in the academic community. But if you look at the nationality corrected data, not the nonsense that all of our money goes to the Caymans, you find that portfolio investment for China and Hong Kong combined, which unfortunately we have to do, was $516 billion in 2016 and was $1.37 trillion in 2020. So that's why I have hostility about a trade war and about US policy driving behavior until 2020. Now in 2022, we don't have 2023 data yet, we won't have it till December probably, it's $910 billion. So portfolio exposure drops $460 billion. What's the single biggest cause of that? It's Alibaba's valuation. That's not an American policy. We didn't sanction Alibaba. Why did Alibaba's valuation drop so much? Because Xi Jinping really doesn't like Jack Ma. Because Jack Ma said the Chinese banking system, which is absolutely vital to the Communist Party's control of the economy, was outdated and money needed to leave state banks and go to more efficient and innovative platforms like his. And right after that, he got in a lot of trouble, and so did his company. So that's not a US policy change that stripped out that portfolio investment. All right, I'm going to do imports last because there's been so much discussion of imports, but I'll do exports. Chip exports the U.S. chip exports to China fell sharply in 2023. That was due primarily to rising Chinese output, not to U.S. policy. How can I say that? Because aerospace exports to China rose substantially. Right? If we're really restricting tech exports to China, you wouldn't find it in just one area. Export controls, which get the bane of my life talking to the press. The entity list is a license requirement. It doesn't block anything. You have to submit an application, 70% of which were approved in 2022. BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security, doesn't want to provide us with newer data, which makes me a little suspicious because I really don't like BIS. The law on foundational exports that Congress passed was set aside by Commerce in 2022. They wrote a little blurb on toxins, and they said, oh, by the way, that stuff you want about foundational technology restrictions on exports, that's not going to work. We're just not going to do that. It's a law. Commerce has refused to implement it. The 2023 chip controls have the same carve-outs as the 2022 versions, meaning the biggest chip producers in the world can continue to deal with China the way they have for an indefinite period now. So I really don't see much in the way of effective U.S. export controls. We are talking about it, and the Biden administration did more than the Trump administration, but if Trump wins, Trump's famous comment about export controls is to refer to the so-called national security excuse, you can find this online, and say the United States is open for business. And as you probably are all aware, Donald Trump is obsessed with the trade balance. You don't get a smaller trade balance by restricting exports. So I do not see export controls in the Trump administration. I see export controls moving very slowly in the Biden administration, still not much of a U.S. policy step. Finally, on imports, my colleagues have talked about history, and it's my job to ignore history because I'm in D.C. There was a very big drop in U.S. imports from China recorded in 2023, $110 billion. It takes us back to 2012 level of imports. There was an overall drop in U.S. imports outside of China. So it's not like it just all shifted to some other countries, whether transshipment or not. It's very difficult to find transshipment support at the size of the China import drop. Imports from Mexico rise about 20 billion. I follow Chinese investment in Mexico very, very closely, and there's a lot of talk, and there's not magnitude investment yet that would explain the gap in 2023. The policy community is very interested to find out how much of this was stuffed into de minimis shipments, and we don't have that yet. But that is a possibility. My counter, if I wanted to counter it, because I'm not sure I do, is why would de minimis shipments rise so much in 2023? Like, I understand the incentive, but I don't understand why it would rise so much in 2023. So it looks to me like we had a reversal in outbound portfolio in 2021 due to Chinese attacks on the private sector, which, by the way, were really nasty in 2021. They're not great any other year under Xi Jinping either, but they were really nasty in 2021. And now we have something interesting in trade. And it's too soon. I don't think I'm disagreeing with my colleagues here. It's too soon to tell. We have February goods trade, and it says, okay, well, trade is not recovering from China, but February is a little too early to be saying the year is going to look like that. So I just think we had an outbound portfolio shift, which was welcomed by people like me. We took care of inbound before. We haven't done very much on exports yet, although we talk about it. But a second Biden term, we might see action on exports. And now we have the first big trade move that we can't quite interpret yet. But, going back to a 2012 bilateral deficit, sorry, I'm almost done. I'm just gonna brag for a second. I had to yell at the Biden administration for weeks to include a remark about this in the State of the Union. So we're worried that there's transshipment or de minimis. I mean, transshipment, if you go good by good, doesn't seem to account for even half the drop. And the de minimis, you could be right. And Donald Trump will not say any of those things. So just say you caused the biggest drop in the U.S. bilateral deficit, got us back to 2012 levels, which he completely failed to do, even including COVID. And it's a political win. Now, does that mean it's an economic win? Does that mean it's sustainable? I don't know. But this is something that matters now, because if it persists, we've reset direct trade. And then we have to figure out, well, it wasn't Mexico that substituted for all of it. Vietnam was like a $7 billion increase in imports to the U.S., and exports to the U.S., and it was mostly in communications. We have to figure out what this means. But combined with portfolio investment, we have the first step, I think, towards meaningful decoupling. I don't see a U.S. policy action that caused it. The U.S. policy action, of course, tariffs start in 2018 and they're more intense in 2019. So I think we could have meaningful decoupling. I think it's still coming from China, mostly. Their attacks on the private sector, their dislike of being dependent on the rest of the world. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Derek. We have about 20 minutes for questions and comments from the audience. We have the 2 mics on each side, so if you would please line up to ask your questions. And while you get going, I have the privilege to ask one question or so myself, and actually I have two comments. Jack, one thing is for sure, the foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio flows are much more volatile than trade flows, right? So if you're mentioning major changes in certain years, you know that in a year from now, it could change again, right? So we don't want to put too much emphasis on that, in my view. And then one comment I have for Caroline. So you mentioned that tariffs fully explain the decline in US imports from China, but I guess you mean tariffs plus the COVID disruptions, right? Because there was also a lot of supply chain lacks of shipments that didn't make it because of the shutdown, of the prolonged shutdown in in Chinese production. So could you clarify, like, how much COVID, how much tariffs?
Is that on? Yeah. Yeah, no, in the data between 2017 and 2022, it's fully tariffed. So that was the point of the chart where imports from China in products that didn't have tariffs grew at the same rate as imports from other countries in those products. In tariffed goods, there was a clear distinction. So Chinese growth was way below growth from other countries within those products. So I think COVID affected overall trade, but if it was a COVID effect, China should have been lower, because we're also looking at a long period, and COVID hit different countries at different times, et cetera. So if we're talking about this long period, tariffs fully explain the difference in growth from China versus other countries.
And so are we sure that the COVID-related shutdowns affected the tariff and the non-tariff categories in the same way? Is that controlled for?
Well, this is very, very specific products, and it works within any industry, et cetera. So, I mean, I suppose maybe there's some reason COVID shutdowns affected tariff products differently, but I'm not sure what that reason would be.
So your point to me that portfolio investment, especially is more volatile than trade, is a reasonable point, and I'm going to say it's wrong because it's wrong, even though it's reasonable and seems to be true. And by the way, I'm really disappointed there aren't people jumping up to ask questions. I guess I need to be more provocative. I can do that. The main problem with the U.S.-China relationship is the Federal Reserve of Dallas. Whatever. I'll defend that position if I get some more questions. Look, on the inbound portfolio from China, this is a long-term trend, and it has to do with their balance of payments. You had capital outflow, flight capital, really, from China starting in 2014, and you not coincidentally stopped seeing gross balance of payment surpluses, and they just don't have the money to invest in the U.S. So that's an established trend. It's unlikely to reverse. Chinese competitiveness will decline over time, which means the exports, which drive their current account surpluses, should decline, and so on. On the U.S. side, which I think is really more to your point, like why can't U.S. portfolio flows to China reverse? They could. I doubt they did in 2023. I really enjoyed my friends on Wall Street claiming that China was a great place to invest in 2023 now that zero COVID was over, and all getting crushed. I'm not allowed to directly financially benefit from that due to my positions, but I did emotionally benefit from it marvelously. So I don't, 2024, we're getting, again, this pitch, China's better now, which, it's better than 2023, that's true. But I don't think we're ever going to go back to the positions that we had at the peak in 2020 because of the attacks on the private sector. So I think when we get to 2023 data late this year, it's going to look even worse. Then we might get a 2024 bounce, but it's not going to get us anywhere back to where we were. And of course, the trend has reversed.
Let me just add on your question on the tariffs. People have done this ending in 2019. Is the tariffs?
It is.
It is.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, we are ready for questions. Let's start with, on my left side, Horioka.
Okay. I'm Hiroki Takeuchi, political scientist teaching at SMU. Welcome to Dallas. My question is kind of all of the panelists, but regarding innovation. So you all talk about the topic from the perspective of efficiency. And my question is how is the current shifting patterns of trade, especially with China, what kind of impact does it have on innovation? I ask this question because you actually took global value chains and global supply chains in the same way, but 2 weeks ago when we had a big conference on US-Japan relations, I invited Ulrike Scheder of UC San Diego, Caroline's colleague, and she pointed out that global value chains is where innovation occurs. Global supply chains is logistics. And so my question is really what is the impact on the innovation? And then so that's actually the question for the first two speakers. And then my question to Derek is current China's state and then the US kind of changing stance toward China. How does it impact on China's innovation? Some people say that it will encourage China's innovation because China now is more self-reliant. But at the same time, many other people say that it will have a negative impact on China's innovation.
Yeah, that was a lot of questions, but a couple things. One point I guess we didn't emphasize is that the US-China trade war has really been a boon for other countries. So I think it spurred innovation in places like Mexico, Vietnam, India, Indonesia, et cetera. So I think that's one point. The other point I would make is I think the US-China decoupling is bad for innovation and not just from trade. So two of my colleagues, Rushui Jia and Molly Roberts, are doing extensive work on US and Chinese scientific collaboration at the university level. And what's really striking in their work is that the tensions have reduced collaboration between US and Chinese scholars. And I mean, this is on, really important areas like fusion technology and things like that. And already reducing citations, meaning that even you see it in missing work, so to speak. So I would say that I think it's really bad from a global perspective not to be using resources efficiently through global value chains, but also human resources through sharing knowledge and using different products. And then finally on the China and are these policies spurring? I think they already spurred China to do everything it can to try and produce, the really small semiconductors itself, and that cat's out of the bag. So yeah, probably they pushed, but they already did it. So that's happening. Qualcomm is right there. It actually started from a University of California, San Diego professor was the founder of Qualcomm, and they're very, they do think that China's working harder. They also, it hits innovation because they lost revenues from the Chinese market, which then go into research and development. So 35% of the semiconductor revenues in the US come because we have all the design companies here come from China. So not having those revenues would hit innovation as well. So there's lots of ways in which this is probably bad for innovation.
Jack, do you want to address? Or do you
No,
want to?
just to second the comment that this is actually has been a boom for everyone else. I'm from Costa Rica, and I saw in one of your charts there, biomedical devices are all booming like mad in Costa Rica with a lot of innovation actually happening there. That may be good, that may be bad for the US, but it's one effect. And let me tell you an example that we have studied or starting to study that is related to your question of how one differentiates innovation and global value chains and the reallocation and possible effects on China on the other side. We're studying the case when China restricted rare elements in 2010, where everyone always tells the story that meant the reallocation of a lot of the value chains to China in terms of production, then the batteries, so on and so forth, and that is the case. So one part of that went there, but if you look at patents, every other country, Japan, US, Europe, Australia, increase the number of patents in innovation in rare elements to try to make magnets more efficient and so on and so forth. So it might be that some parts will go to one country, some others in others. And indeed, in terms of semiconductors, what seems that is happening is that we're trying to get production out of China, and China's going to start their own production. Where the innovation might end, I think we're going to have to go and see.
So this actually gets at the whole fundamental debate over globalization, in my view, because who innovates and where innovation occurs matter? Or is it just that we all benefit from innovation and so it's good? And if who and where matters, it's a different question, then there'll be less innovation. And you know, China has tried to relocate innovation spending following trying to relocate manufacturing. So it's trying to bring innovation spending to China. There's coercive technology transfer. There are incentives to do so and so on. They think it matters that the innovation occurs in China, even if it's done by foreign companies. And so if you get US-China tech decoupling, which again, I don't think has gone very far. I mean, there's a lot of noise about you have to apply for a license to do things and then they just do it anyway. If you get that, does it matter that foreigners are going to innovate less in China physically and that China will try to innovate more? If you talk to the financial side people, they think we can make money in the Chinese financial system because the US financial firms are better than Chinese financial firms. And so even when China loses money, because the Chinese stock market peaked in 2007, we can still make money. So are foreigners better innovators, in which case China can't substitute for them by just scale, spending more, trying to do more, or not? And I think foreigners are better innovators, but maybe not, or maybe they are temporarily. That's the question. The Chinese are looking at a possible trade-off of them innovating versus foreigners innovating in China, and that may cost them. I will say I have a different view than Qualcomm, shockingly enough, on some of this. If you look at, I can do history, the pace of US R&D growth, domestic R&D growth, so located here, not by US firms, located in the United States, it's faster before China's WTO entry than it is afterwards. And that doesn't surprise me. China is trying to take innovation away from other countries. But the stuff about we get a lot of revenue for innovating, okay, but where is that innovation occurring? Again, does it matter that American firms are innovating in the United States or somewhere else? I don't have a definitive position. I would say, however, that it's not clear to me that China has been good for American innovation. It's been good for the world's innovation. And then finally, if you look at recent gross data, and I haven't done the deflators on this to put them in proper perspective, you're getting surges in measured U.S. innovation spending in 2001, 2002, 2003. So the Chinese were narrowing the absolute gap in spending, and now they're not anymore. And again, you have a question of, okay, so the U.S. is compensating for lost revenue from China, and we're innovating more here. We're spending more here. Does it matter that we're spending more here? Is this a less efficient place to innovate? So that's my answer. We're going to get compensating spending by the US and China to offset the disruption of an innovation system from decoupling. If we decouple on the technology side, both sides will invest to offset it. But does that change the nature of the innovation and make it less effective? That's a good question. It's possible.
Let's switch sides and take a question from the right.
Yeah, I have a question on energy, and anyone can answer this. So the Dallas Fed had a chart about exports, and I think it was from the last decade, largely the exports were energy, and largely they were from Texas and Louisiana. And I believe the number, U.S. exports were virtually flat, but when you consider energy, it's like we were 83%. Energy was 83% of the export value in the United States, and it was something like $318 billion between Texas and Louisiana in 2022. Excuse me. Developing Asia, natural gas grows like roughly up to 10%. This is a stat I saw to 2040. So there's a lot of growth in natural gas. And our LNG is like 20% of global supply now. That was in 2022, and we kind of rescued Europe from that. So when you're talking about decoupling and nearshoring, and how do you see this energy equation both in trade and in FDI? I know at one point China was investing in our shale boom in the early parts of the oil shale boom, and I don't know that that's happening so much now with a lot of the change in sentiment. So just anybody that can address that, how they see that, and how that plays forward. Thanks.
Can I just ask you to clarify, are you interested in energy in U.S.-China or U.S. energy connections to the world more broadly?
Well, Asia and China, because we export LNG to China. I believe we also export crude to China.
Yes.
That's a competitive advantage, obviously, of the United States. So just anybody, thoughts, comments?
So let me just say quickly, the Chinese did invest early in shale. Like all other Chinese investment, this has dropped. It's odd because those are state-owned enterprises, most led by Sinopec. But the state-owned oil enterprise has gotten a lot of trouble domestically because they were overpaying for projects as a means of illegal activity and lining their own pockets. So I think China is perfectly willing for state-owned, state-controlled oil enterprises to invest overseas, and that may occur again in the U.S., but it's not occurring now. Yes, U.S. It used to be like we would sell planes and we would sell soybeans. And now energy has joined that as part of and scrap, which is just very depressing when you see scrap as an American export. All right, I'll be quick. Sorry, we're getting hand signals. So that is a part of U.S. comparative advantage. I don't know that we need to ship directly to China. As you know very well, the energy market will adjust. If the Chinese say, "Oh, we'll show you, we won't buy your energy," we'll ship it somewhere else in Asia, and they might, we'll ship it to Singapore, and they'll transship it, or someone else will buy it. It is a factor in U.S.-China relations, but I don't think it's a strategic factor because the U.S. is going to ship to world demand, whether China is involved in it or not.
All right, then we have a question for one more final question. The gentleman on the left.
Thank you. Good morning. This is Gildardo Zafra from Dallas. I would like to know more about the foreign direct investment and merger and acquisition that has happened in the last 10 years in the globalization, right? I mean, I can understand the export and imports, but at what point a merger and FDI becomes a threat to a market? And when do we need to start putting barriers to stop those foreign companies to come into our markets? And saying this, should we talk about regionalization rather than globalization? I mean, just making sure that your region is economically strong enough to protect that economic region? Thank you.
Okay, sure. One more question from the...
Mine should be pretty quick. I'm a research assistant at Texas A&M, the Bush School, with the Mosbacher Institute. And I just wanted to know what you guys think of China's exchange rate, given that many say it's undervalued and it's made exporting easier in the past. And do you think that will have any impact on future trade?
On what, sorry?
Future trade.
I'll take that question.
Okay. Why don't you?
Take that question?
Yes, second question. So it's impossible to know what the proper valuation of China's exchange rate is because the capital account is closed. You cannot freely take money out of China. So the suspicion is that if you were allowed to take freely money out of China, money would pour out of China and put enormous downward pressure on the exchange rate. And in fact, the exchange rate is therefore overvalued. But we don't know that. It makes China's exchange rate less sensitive to trade because trade and capital are both supposed to affect exchange rates. The trade movement, China has this wonderfully successive trader, what trade with a D. Why doesn't the exchange rate, rise? Why doesn't it appreciate in response to that? Because there's this other factor that we don't know what its real effect is, and it's held stagnant. So the answer is, if you just look at trade in isolation, there are certainly periods where the exchange rate looked undervalued. But I wouldn't say that's true now. I actually think the exchange rate is overvalued, and it's very difficult to tell when you don't allow capital to move freely. This is something that's seized upon in Washington, because if you just say exports are soaring and China's exchange rate is not rising, it looks bad. But that's not the only factor in an exchange rate.
Well, I think Laura's better placed to talk about foreign direct investment, or Derek. I was just going to add to that, because there was a second part to that question about trade. And that, I think as China's exchange rate falls, that will increase the supply of Chinese goods to the rest of the world at a really competitive price. And both the over-subsidizing of certain products in combination with that has led to calls from both the US, and Yellen was recently talking about it in China, as well as the European Union, about this oversupply flooding the market with cheap goods, especially in those industries where they're subsidized. So I do think, especially as their economy is really struggling under numerous different challenges right now, that trying to export their way out is going to be difficult for the world.
I just didn't understand what was the perspective. From the perspective of the US, of the perspective of Mexico and the US? Again, keep in mind that who's a friend today may not necessarily be a friend tomorrow. Just to give you an example, Cuba used to be a friend. So that's why I'm not sure what you mean by we.
Overall, have you seen an increase on FDI in the last 10 years as a consequence of the globalization phenomenon, or not necessarily? I mean, are you seeing more Mexican companies expanding their companies here to the US market and Canada, or they are just exporting to the US and Canada? Just totally different.
So again, those two are not necessarily the same. So it's different, the regional integration of NAFTA, UMSCA, versus what's going on in the world. What is going on in the world, you do see, after the global financial crisis, FDI going down, and people have taken that also as this trend of the globalization, but one has to be careful because, again, a big player used to be China, and China's not explicitly allowing. And so that tainted a little bit those numbers. But in the case of NAFTA, it was very active. Now there's this little change that UMSCA did in terms of investor protection that I don't know if we have seen it played out, but that may have effects. I think now there's going to be one interesting case related to that. But to your bigger question, overall, after the global financial crisis, yes, there was a slowdown.
I think we're already a little bit over time, so let's wrap it up here. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists.